Hi, it's Rachel Maldonado. Belief in the human spirit and desire to connect is the reason I want to tell your story and mine. And I am with Tom Luongo, a geopolitical analyst. Tell me about this.
Oh, good morning, Rachel, and thank you for the invite. It's I'm happy to be here. So me, what I do, I have a long and storied history. This will be very interesting because I started out as a chemist 35 years ago, and now I'm here doing analyzing the intersection of geopolitics, markets, culture, and all of these things as a and for my website, Gold, Goats, and Guns. So thank you for the invite. This is what we do. Now it's gonna be fun.
Wow. So, your podcast,
Mhm.
Gold, Goats, and Guns, how did you come up with that name?
Oh, that actually is a great little story. So when I first went to work for Newsmax, I also write a financial newsletter for Newsmax. I write Ultimate Wealth Report for them. I also contribute to another newsletter called Financial Intelligence Report. But when I first went to work for Newsmax, I got hired to write a gold stock um, newsletter, focused newsletter. When we first got there, they did a big retreat down at the Newsmax headquarters down in Boca Raton at the time. I think it was Boca Raton. Yeah, that's where they were. And so we had all the newsletter writers, we had all the editors, we had the publishers, we had everybody there for a big weekend, and we all got to know each other. And so at the end of that weekend, I had to give a speech and chat with people, blah 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 blah. The assistant publisher at the time said, we all went around the table, and you could do one of these corporate things, and they all say, okay, what did you learn this weekend? We got to this guy, and he said, I learned two things. I learned one, Tom Luongo is freaking committed. He not only lives talks the life he wants, he lives that life. And I want to do a promotion on his newsletter called Gold, Goats, and Guns. Now, we never did the promotion, but after that stint with Newsmax ended in early 2017, and I was kind of flat on my back, broke, and okay, now all my income went away. What am I going to do? I had to go independent. And when I did that, I'm like, I'm going with this. I do a lot of things instinctually, and one of those things, and I'm nothing if not quirky and an iconoclast in this respect. And I'm always looking for something like, it's weird, right? So, you know, that's what I came up with. I went, well, the writer in me says, cool, I like alliteration. I like what that says, and bubble. It's a terrible name from a branding perspective because people trip over it all the time. And, no marketing guru, right? No marketing guru could walk in the room and say, I want to do this, this, and this, and the name Gold, Goats, and Guns would not come off their lips. And they look at you like you got 14 heads, and syphilis if you actually suggested that's how you want to do it. But somehow we've made it work. So there we are.
Well, I actually love Gold, Goats, and Guns. I think it's very fun and very fitting for current times.
Mhm.
And Tom, how do you know how to just go off your gut? You said you're very instinctual. Were you born with this? Is it come with experience?
Oof. I don't know. I've always been in, like, okay, so this gets a little, not I would say uncomfortable or anything, but I've always been someone attracted to that which is not the mainstream. So, even as a kid, I've always been attracted to. I was just thinking about this recently. Actually, I wrote about it a little bit. Always, a bit of I always take the iconoclast perspective. So whenever the dominant thought, I was always just take the contrarian position almost as a badge of honor, and then to see where it would go. And that means, you know, championing like weird authors or, or whatever it happened to be. And so it was always there. But then, and what that winds up leading you to do is you wind up finding things that are, one, outside of the mainstream, and two, potentially actually very ahead of the curve. If you
Mm.
are a good, if you have an inherent sense of that's um that's vital, that's interesting, and I've always been that way. I have to say I have always been that way. And when I first started, I didn't read a lot as a kid. I spent a lot of time like watching sports, a very kind of normie, um you know blue collar, upstate New York. My parents were civil servants. My dad was a cop, mom was a nurse, blah, 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 blah. And we had a very kind of normie, not intellectually inquisitive home, right? When I started finally reading for my own enjoyment, I, always enjoyed, I was a big Star Wars fan, always, was science fiction as opposed to mainstream literature. So that's the first step. And then the second step was I fell in love with Philip K. Dick well before everybody else did. So in the 1980s, when I was graduating high school in 86, I probably had at the time one of the best collections of old Philip K. Dick novels, had been out of print for 15 years in the world at 16 years old, right? I owned like 30 of his novels. And at that point, only some of them were starting to come back into print because of Blade Runner, right, in 1982, and which started the Renaissance but at that moment in time, like, I remember going to the book section over at the Caldors in Valesgate, which is just north of where I grew up, and going with my mom, and like, and I would go like through the entire book section. I would like look for 3 authors, and I and if there's something new got reprinted, I pulled it off the shelf, bought it for $1.75. Eventually read it. Some of them were terrible, many of them were terrible, but there's that 10 or 11 novels out of the 40 that Phil wrote that are possibly some of the best fiction written in the 20th century, period. And we only now realize this, but I was like sitting there as the senior in high school going, this guy's literature. We're going to be talking about him in the same way we talk about Shakespeare in 100 years. I was saying that at 18, but no one believed me. No one had any idea what I was talking about, because, he was literally an unknown science fiction writer at that point. Today, no, today they're putting him in the National Archives. Right?
So you hit the trends, and you are accurate. What was one of your early wins? That was when you were 16, but what was an early win that your instincts, you got it right?
Ketogenic diet. We went keto. My wife and I went ketogenic in the mid 1990s, and started cleaning up our health issues. Like, we were way ahead of the curve on that. My wife and I together are a very interesting pair. I say this all the time. If you think I'm a smart guy, forget it. My wife makes me look like a moron. And part of the reason why that is because she's fascinated by all things that I'm not fascinated by. So we've been together now 31 years. And I have one 16-year-old daughter. She's about to turn 17. And if you talk about regrets, my biggest regret is that we didn't have kids earlier, and we didn't have more children. But it is what it is. We were also both kind of broken kids from emotionally abusive homes. So you do what you can with what you've got, and which isn't much, right? So but it's that it's almost like, I don't know if it's a desire to run away from that which you had. This is not to throw shade on my parents or anything. They did the best they could with who they were. But it's I don't know where that comes from, and where that came from, but we were like peas in a pod. And so all the things that I was interested in, as I'm studying chemistry as an undergraduate, that's where we met in college. And I'm studying chemistry, and I'm like fascinated by quantum mechanics, but I'm not thinking about all this stuff philosophically. I'm not thinking about this stuff in like how to be a better chemist, how to like practically apply it in the real world. I went through 5 years of a chemistry degree, and it took me that long because I'm lazy, and but then again, I was also doing undergraduate research in effectively high energy physics, attached to the guys who were attached to the quantum theory group in the physics department. So we were doing the intersection of chemistry and physics. Like, I could go into the insane stuff I was doing at 22 years old, right? And almost went to graduate school to do. I don't know, like, the big win is just, for me, I don't know. It's that realizing, I guess it was the day I realized, when I might have even been that day when that guy at Newsmax saw me in that light.
Ooh.
And went, wow. And I'm just doing what I do, right? And I don't know how to be any other way. But then to finally have somebody else reflected back at you in a way that, at a professional level, whereas I'm the new guy in the room. You have to understand, I had been hired by Newsmax literally a week earlier. I just turned in my first copy, right, for my first issue. And everybody in the room was like, yeah, that guy's going somewhere. And
Yes.
and I didn't see it, right? I didn't have any clue. I'm just like trying to hang on for dear life and, not, you know, not get fired. Let's be honest here. I just came out of 2 years of grinding unemployment and kind of working to become, put myself in the position to accept that job where I was working with a broker out of Vietnam. So we're literally trying to build a business over Skype, and he's in Vietnam and I'm in Florida. And so I'm working from 7 o'clock at night to 7 a.m. and sleeping on the couch until 11, and then working from 11 to 7 until he wakes up. And I was working 18-hour days for 2 years straight. And
Yes.
it was crazy, writing financial reports, learning how to read a balance sheet, doing technical analysis, writing and editing article after article after article, and not even in my name. I was writing under his name. So I ghost wrote for him for 2 years, including a book. And
Wow.
it was a mutually beneficial thing. I learned a tremendous amount. So it was like a paid internship. I was getting paid 12 grand a year, but it was a paid internship. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So,
Yes. And did you do you always think 10 steps ahead? You're ghostwriting, he's getting all the credit for your work, but you think I'm learning and I have the opportunity to figure stuff out so I can do things on my own in my name. Do you think 10 steps ahead? Or was that just a happy happenstance that it worked out that way?
I'll be honest with you. I don't plan much, right? But the only project I actually planned semi properly was the house we built. Right. I'm doing this in my office, and my office is upstairs in a room in a house that I built along with my wife. My wife and I built our house in 2003. We did 90% of the work ourselves. We did all the design work. We were the general contractors, but the only thing we didn't build the trusses, and we didn't insulate the place. But she was the electrician, I was the plumber. We were both the framing carpenters. At that time, I called in favors to have a whole bunch of people come in, and like incompetent Amishmen would go out on the weekends and try and build a house. And we didn't do bad. Like, it was, we learned a lot, and, I got into shape and a variety of other things, but that was driven out of this fear that I knew that there was something wrong with the world. I understood by 2002, 2003, after the collapse in Y2K, and I started down the rabbit hole of realizing that politically I was a libertarian. So politically and philosophically, I believed in property rights, hard currencies, 100% reserve banking, like all of this stuff, and an individual consumer sovereignty or personal sovereignty. And I believe that so freaking strongly that I'm like, I ain't raising my child, in downtown Gainesville on Hogtown Creek. I ain't doing it. And it turns out there was an excellent decision, because Hogtown Creek was incredibly polluted, and it actually massively affected my fertility, because the house was soaked to the gills with dioxin that we were living in. The house has since been razed to the ground. The whole neighborhood's actually been razed to the ground. My daughter's actually a miracle.
Wow.
So, because, we actually went to a fertility doctor at one point, and he was like, because my wife was desperate, and she's like, he just looked at her, he said, if you want to have kids, you're not having them with him.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And then a month later, after, we, kind of went on a vitamin regimen, and I swore off, and I wasn't never a heavy drinker, but, swore off whiskey and swore off everything. And my wife was like, no, and then a month later, this is a great story, actually. So, I know so little about this stuff. So every month it was, hey, how we doing? It's that time of the month. And she's like, nope.
Yes.
Her, Aunt Flo showed up. And the funniest story about that was that, sometimes the month a woman gets pregnant, she can still have her period.
Really?
And my
Oh.
wife did. And I had already checked out for a couple of days, disappointed again. And on a Sunday morning, sitting there reading the first Harry Potter book in bed, and she comes in with the biggest smile on her face I'd ever seen, and a glass of whiskey in one hand, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, and a tumbler in the other, and I'm like, but how? And she's like, well, how? I'm like, so right? And but and I'm doing the stutter thing. I'm on the typical male. How did this happen? But it's because, right? It's because she'd already 2 days earlier told me that, hey, it didn't work this month.
Yes.
But
Wow, that is an amazing story.
hilarious.
Wow.
But that's my life. That's been my life. Yeah.
It's like sometimes you have to struggle a little bit, but then is it sweeter when it works out?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, look, no one wants to struggle in this life, but I am a firm believer that, it is that hard time that look, easy times make weak men make hard times make strong men, make weak times, make easy times make weak men, blah blah blah. The routine. Um, if you have the right attitude and you have the right level of humility towards the world, and you realize that, look, there ain't nothing in this life that will, honestly, I don't know how salty I'm allowed to be. I'm usually quite salty, right, with my language. But when the universe kicks you enough times, well, guess what? You either submit to it or you keep fighting against it. You can only do one. You can only go one or two ways. And when I watch people constantly making the same mistake over and over again, I'm not saying that I haven't, because I have, and then not being willing to really assess their own behavior and go, okay, do you not get that you're struggling against the same thing that you were struggling against last week, and it's the same problem? Can you not see that? Like, when I get flipped with people, when they disagree with me, when I've clearly laid out why I'm right, I'm like, no, this is your position is more of it's 9 times out of 10 when you're dealing with somebody who you can't communicate with, it's because they're trapped in their own worldview. They're trapped within the purview of their own ideology, and it's like they're stuck in Socrates' cave, looking at the false reality on the wall and scared to look away. It's not that, and it is Socrates' cave, not Plato's cave. Everybody go read Plato again. It's Socrates' lesson that Plato is telling everyone. I can't believe I have to say that every time I bring that up, right? But I do. There's a lot of maleducation out there. There's a lot of malinformation out there, right? And that's actually part of this conversation. When you're dealing with somebody who's like, who you can't get through, even to explain your side of the story, even if they don't agree with it. I'm like, okay, at this point, what you're doing now is you're just projecting your anxieties back on me. And I really do think that this conversation is over and you need therapy. I'm not being flipped. You need therapy. By the way, I need therapy. I'm in therapy. I got one on Wednesday. I got a session on Wednesday. Guy's nice. We chat about stuff. I brain dump on him. I don't know if we're making any progress or not, but it's nice to pay a third party person every once in a while to just dump whatever's like laying on your head and not be ashamed of it. Like, the hell do I have to be ashamed of? Like, my entire life is shameful. You either accept it or you don't accept it. Like, you either accept, your failings and your limitations. Man's got to know his limitations, as the famous line from the movie goes, or, you're going to continue to constantly struggle with things. And, when you're in the financial markets, nothing is more humbling, because you're like, you're the smallest fish in the biggest pond. Like, tides can overwhelm you if you're not being willing to submit to the process of learning everything you can and understanding that whatever you thought you knew today, you will be like 95% of it will likely have been challenged and repudiated the next day. And I think having been trained as a scientist and work as a scientist, like, I'm a good friends with Dave Collum. I don't know if you know who that is, but Dave is another guy like me. He's a chemist, but he's far more accomplished chemist, since he's the head of organic chemistry at Cornell University and his own investor. And so he's, done as his hobby over the years writing about markets. And he would do Dave has been doing this kind of year-end summation of the world. And since then, he's been doing it for about 15 years, and slowly but surely he's built a reputation as a really fascinating and interesting market commentator. It's completely orthogonal to his life as, the dude over at Cornell University that runs the organic chemistry department, right? But he loves it. And now he's kind of a minor, like, like all of us in this space, kind of a minor celebrity, and and a great raconteur and a great guy to chat with. But Dave and I share that same kind of weird worldview of, well, yeah, like you put out a hypothesis and nothing's going to kick you in the behind more than doing real science, not what they tell us is science,
Yes.
but real science, where you have a hypothesis and then you're wrong 99% of the time. But every failure leads to the next discovery, because 99% of all science ever put out has been wrong. Because if it wasn't wrong, we would know everything.
Yes.
We don't know everything, clearly. So.
Yes. Well, Tom, I very much appreciate that you mentioned that you advocate for therapy and you're in therapy, because I'm a therapist and a life coach. So, of course, that made me very happy. So good for you. I'm glad. And I have a question.
Sure.
How do you balance the humility? But also, you mentioned, hey, man, I'm right a lot. How do you do that?
How do you do that? Well, you keep it. That's hard. And that's a really, I'm glad you picked up on that, because it is hard. And I know I tend towards the path. The reason why I eventually, my wife and I, thought about this and she recommended this, was because, look, I have, and we all do have that tendency that as you're right about things, as you're, Malcolm Gladwell will call us early adopters or whatever. That my wife and I are the people who have 1% of the population who can see the big trend and see the next thing well before everybody else, and they all think we're crazy, right? It's the Cassandra syndrome. And then eventually you get to the one, and I'm at, we're at that stage. I'm at that stage now with my arguments about the Federal Reserve versus Davos and all of this stuff. That's actually where a lot of people are now like trying to figure out what's going on, because I'm completely ahead of the curve on this. But again, the marriage between what Ian McGilchrist would call the left brain, the analytic side, and the right brain, the synthetic side, I listened to both of them because, well, I forgot to tell you that the reason why it took me 5 years to get my degree was in chemistry, was because I spent all my time in poetry writing workshops in the English department, and taking, all of my electives and refusing to take more than 10 or 11 credits a semester in my last 2 years in college. And that's the way it is. That's what and playing board games on the side and trying to fail out here and there, right? Like, this is what I was doing. So, but it all comes back around in the end. Like, all of these are just skill building exercises, right? And I didn't figure this out until I started doing this for real, under the crucible of write or die, of find an audience or start digging, or get better at digging ditches, because that's all you've got available to you. Because once you're in this space where I am politically, which is, I'm out 180 degrees out of phase with the dominant political paradigm, no HR department in the world will touch me today if I wanted to go back and get a real job, right? So what am I going to do? Like, I have to do this, and I have to survive at this now, because I've staked out this public persona. Right. I've made that commitment. And once you make that commitment, you don't have, it's like, yep, there we go. But the balancing the ego versus the humility, again, that comes from having people around you, accumulating people around you who constantly error check you, inviting the people you bring around you to do that. And then the scientific training, and the fact that I've gone broke in the markets a couple of, at least twice at very important moments of my life. It wasn't a lot of money, but for me, it was a lot of money. And both times it was for key amounts of money that were that delayed capital formation into my 50s. So I lost, I wiped myself out in my 20s, in my late 30s, my early, I wiped myself out. And where did that come from? It came from being arrogant. It came from not being in balance with those two things. So, where I am today, emotionally, physically, financially, professionally, it's all because of those past failures. And, I was chatting with a friend of mine yesterday, and literally yesterday, I said, look, I don't learn by reading. I don't learn by I'm not, we're all who's a visual learner, who's an oral learner, who's a kinetic learner. Well, I'm a kinetic learner. My particular superpower is that I learn by failure. I don't learn by success. I learn by failure. If I fail, that's when I'm like, oh, right. It's a train. That's what's going on, right? I really do learn by failure. And because 9 times out of 10, and this is something that the markets will always teach you, is that there's nothing, in science will teach you the same thing, which is that there's nothing worse than being right for the wrong reason.
Ooh.
So, and I remember, and this is directly a lesson from my undergraduate chemistry degree, and I'll never forget this. This is one of those, it's like one of those sermons, I was raised Catholic, so every once in a while you remember a particularly good sermon that, or book or story or whatever it is that changes your perspective on things. Well, the original, I think it's Niels Bohr, and I may get this wrong, who it was, but I think it was Bohr. So Bohr solved for the energy state of the electron in a hydrogen atom using classical mechanics, using Newtonian mechanics, right? I know this is a little geeky, but but I'm going to hand wave the math away. Just say Newtonian mechanics do not adequately describe quantum systems. They don't describe electrons and their move. It doesn't do it. It's not adequate. It's why we have quantum mechanics to explain that world, and we have thermodynamics and classical mechanics to explain the world you and I live in and we experience every day. And why quantum mechanics is so very difficult for people to understand, as my mentor, my intellectual mentor on this, and my undergraduate advisor, Dr. Phil Brucat over at the University of Florida, said the reason why we have a hard time learning quantum mechanics is because we don't play quantum baseball. We play Newtonian baseball. We play billiards. That's Newtonian mechanics. Well, for the hydrogen atom, because there's only one electron, you can actually solve mathematically using Newtonian mechanics for the ground state energy of a hydrogen atom in the gas phase. You can do it. Bohr did it, and he got the right answer. But he couldn't replicate that model when he went to helium and added another electron. Then the whole model breaks down. So he was right, but for exactly the wrong reason. And that's where, based on that work and based on that inquisition is what drove Schrodinger and Heisenberg and drove the next level of this, because he was observably wrong when looking at helium, lithium, beryllium, and everybody else on the first row of the transit. And the error just gets worse the more electrons you add, right? Because that's the way the world, because you're farther away from that. And so that's a mathematical model of a real system that is false. Now, if that's not the metaphor for our entire society today built around central banking, I don't know what is. Yes. And so when I started getting into finance, all of this training in the interface between, the understanding the differences between the rules and at the Newtonian mechanics level and at the quantum level, and that interface, and understand that as an undergraduate, that same guy, Dr. Brucat, said, okay, your undergraduate research project is to define that limit between where quantum mechanics takes over and this particular system and Newtonian mechanics. He's just like, yeah, he's smart enough to handle this. Like, as an undergraduate, he was doing that. Like, that's where we were. And I'm like, so I always understood, so I had a very weird perspective on this stuff when I got to the real world, but you take those lessons with you. So for me, many of those, like the last 2 or 3 classes in my chemistry degree, be it physical chemistry 1 and 2, and probably second semester analytic chemistry, were the ones where the lessons, they were like sermons for how you live your life, as opposed to how you become a better chemist. Because that's the way I was reading them, because I was writing about them that way. I was writing poetry based on this stuff. I was pissing off the entire creative writing department over at the University of Florida because they were all Marxists and they didn't like the fact that I was doing this, and it was like it was hilarious. And they, I was getting B's and C's in creative writing classes. Like, how do you do? Because it was just petty.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah, it's
Wow.
just petty because of the ideological difference. But I'm like, no, dude, you're wrong. I'm working at a different level. I'm not saying this poem's any good, but like, that's a different story. We'll have that conversation later. But you're wrong about the metaphor. You're wrong about these things. And I would argue and I would buck any constraint that somebody tried to put on me. I would just buck them and just say no. So
Yes.
that I have a whole ton of stories about that era of my life as well, which is really fascinating. It's really funny, actually.
So you are not afraid to learn from failure when everybody else is afraid, especially fear with financials. And do you think that has given you an edge, understanding
I
and
don't know.
with others?
I don't know. I really wish I did, Rachel. I don't know. I just know that this is the way I am. Like, and the funny part is that my partner in Gold, Goats, and Guns, Dexter White, is a much more cautious human being. He's much more, he really does like go down, he really does we're very similar in that we're both, high strung alpha personalities, for lack of a better term. I'm not crazy about alpha beta male designations, but, for as a hand waving argument. And we're both incredibly opinionated, but as far as our process is concerned, yeah, he's like, no, the ducks have to be in a row as we move forward, so that this is built on this strong foundation. I'm like, great, that makes you a great COO. I'm the CEO. I'm the one with the strategic vision of going, yeah, we need to get there. And if we dither too much on this thing, I'm just going to go forward and do something. Now that's driven all sorts of conflict over the last 5 years. And he is also one of my oldest friends. So that's an interesting emotional dynamic to navigate. But the fun part about this is that both of us have been kind of validated to be right because we've made it work. Because at the end of the day, what's important is not how we go from point A to point B to point C to point D. It is that we say to ourselves, we're going to get there. And all we're going to do to get there is we're going to do the very best freaking work we possibly can. And eventually quality sells itself. People find, you find your audience. And as a podcaster, there's an audience for everybody. You may only have an audience of 50 people, right? But you'll find that if you stick with it long enough, you will find those people, right? And you'll find most of your total addressable market. I understand that my market for the things that I do, that synthetic work, as powerful as it is for certain people, I also know that it flies completely over the heads of 90% of the people who come in contact with my work. It is what it is. So, that's fine. I don't have any ambitions on that other than just, hey, I need to make this a going concern. Now we're at a position where it's a going concern. And now we have to strategically, we have to think about it in terms of, okay, how can we make this sustainable? How can we make what we have better for the people that we have? We've curated into the community, and how can we make the community itself more powerful? Because the community is what I learn off of every day. And, I'm just the kind of the public face of this 2,700 person hive mind that generates unbelievable amounts of really interesting insights. And I know it's a back and forth, right? I know it's and that's part of the humility thing, because I step into conversations on my own private, Slack server with my patrons, people who are paying me money and are giving me ideas and insights that I never would have thought of. So how do you sit back and go, yeah, I know it. Like, no, you're like literally sitting there all day long getting fed this information, and they're bringing the internet to you. They're bringing the world to you, and you don't even have to go out and find it anymore. And so it's that in and of itself is incredibly humbling, because these are people who are paying me to do research for me. Crazy. And it's awesome. And at the same time, I get to give them credit publicly every time I go out and do an interview. And I say it all the time. And then, by the way, that interestingly enough, because I do that, people are like, wow, that's really cool. He gives credit to his patrons for helping him become, and then they sign up. And it becomes a self-reinforcing thing because it's about the ethos of the community and less about the particular person and or idea. That's what's important. You're now in this world that is fracturing and everybody's so on edge. The goal of just finding people who are not crazy, and maybe they are a little crazy, but they're not crazy in they're crazy in ways that are sympathetic to you, right? We're all a little crazy, and that's good because that little crazy is what drives creativity. It drives the world. It drives all of it. But we're all not. It's not a hive mind of like-minded people. It's a hive mind of similarly philosophical people. Better way of putting it, or however similar ethos, which is, yeah, we want the world to be, this is how we believe we're going to get to a better world. And now and we all see that this is a vehicle to put those ideas out into the universe to help, make our case. And then if those ideas are good and true, they will propagate. And if they aren't, they won't. And it's just that simple. And that's where the real humility comes from. And that's where the market will always tell you whether you're right or not.
Yes. So you have this community that you learn from. And do you feel like this community and everybody figuring it out, that you want to get that message and these right ideas about financials and geopolitics to the world because it will affect all of us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about, we're analyzing, myself and Dexter White and many members of the community are analyzing in real time the big geopolitical chess game. I don't actually like to even call it a chess game. I did a speech over at the Ron Paul Institute on foreign policy over the summer. I called it a 7-player game of Go. Imagine a game of Go with 7 different colored stones. But this is the thing. I play board games that are like that are 5-player games of Go, right? And but there's just cards and ships and money and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, it's all about blocking people off from where they want to go, and it's all area control, but in board gaming speak. So I live to do this. As a matter of fact, when I get done with this interview this morning, I'm going to finish up a little bit of work at home, and then I'm going to go for my all-day gaming session with my friends from noon until 11 p.m. We're going to board game for 11 hours straight, and I think that's not enough time. Okay, it's crazy, right? Because I played board games that take 11 hours to play. We don't play those very often anymore, but they're fun. But I don't know, the if you don't believe it in what you're doing, then you're not going to do it well, right? You're going to do a facsimile of doing it well, right? So if you come at things honestly and you come at it with with honesty and a modicum of humility, it's always a balancing. And like you said earlier, it's a balancing act. You have to be willing, you have to be arrogant enough to believe that what you're going to put out there in the universe, people should listen to. It may be wrong, but you think it should be listened to at the very least, because if it is wrong, someone's going to come back at you into the, you put something out on the internet, someone's going to tell you you're wrong. Now, the question is whether or not they're going to be right about you being wrong. And that's where the fun begins. And if they are, then all of a sudden you learn something and you go, oh, I didn't think of that. Okay, cool. Thank you. Yes, you're right. I'm wrong. And then I'll go and, as I like to put it now, I'll go and recalculate. Ayn Rand always famously said, as you encounter the world, you should always check your premises about how the world operates, about how the other person is operating or whatever. Hey, man, you may be wrong about that. You should check your premises. Now I just use the phrase recalculate because I'm dealing with, certainly on Twitter, you're dealing with a lot of people who are very, very analytically oriented. We're breeding so many people who have some version of Asperger's that, they understand the phrase recalculate a whole lot better than check your premises. If you're a physicist, like if you've ever sat in a college physics classroom, that makes sense because of the way physics is taught, right? physics is taught as a series of thought experiments where you just take a simple precept, set a variable, set x equal to blah, and then derive all of the basic equations of classical mechanics. This is how it's done. And it's a fascinating process. It's not they don't tell you force equals ma, mass times acceleration. They go, let x equal force, and then they derive that through integral calculus and give you the answer. And then we get the answer there. This is why force equals mass times acceleration. Okay, if you agree with the original premise, then everything after that should be logically correct.
You call it recalculate, I say pivot, and you analyze geopolitics. So what would you say some of these major recalculations are in the current landscape?
The first one, the biggest one for me is that we can all perceive that there's an us that runs the world and a them that is us, right? The old George Carlin line, it's a big club and we ain't in it, right? Well, that club is fracturing. The reason that club is fracturing is because the system on which their power was built has reached its terminal limit in terms of they can't get any more blood from us stones.
The serfs
and
the
when
people.
No, what's that? Yeah, no, seriously. When you look, economics is not bloodless. It's not numbers. It is your time and your energy and your life that they are taking bits and pieces of. Your profit as we act in the universe, right? We're doing so in such a way that we think it's going to profit us in the future. We may be wrong about that, but we believe that we're going to be profitable by doing it. So, for example, I use this example all the time. You and I are sitting here having this conversation because I believe at some level it's profitable for me to do so, meaning I'm going to be introduced to a new audience, or you and I are going to have a lovely conversation and I'm going to learn something, or right? Pick whatever vector of my psyche you want to impose, and I'm going to profit from one of those. Now, could I profit more by writing another article, put out in the zeitgeist? Possibly. But you know what? We're doing this morning. That's the decision that I made.
You'll be glad you did.
I'm ecstatic to be here. Don't get me wrong. I'm just like going through this is the way my mind works, right? So will we act in order to make profit on ourselves and to make our future self and the life of our future self more predictable than the life of our former self, our past self. Simply put, that's what we're doing through time. And with every action that we take, whether we're conscious of this or not, that profit is very small. On an individual economic action basis, it's very, very small. If you have a system, a monetary system, and a banking system that is designed or a political system that here's your profit, but in order for you to live in this world, you got to give us this much. Oh, well, that's not enough anymore because it's not working. We got to give you this much. And eventually they take it all, which is where we are today. Once they've taken it all the profit for themselves, leaving us with literally bare subsistence. We're back to feudalism. If you look very carefully at what's being built in Europe with the European Union and what they are advocating for, it's very clear that the old oligarchs of Europe, the old feudal lords of Europe, still want to be feudal lords over Europe, but now they want to be feudal lords over the world. So they're ultimately our enemy. These are the people who imposed the freaking lockdowns on us. These are the people who, told us that COVID-19 was going to kill everyone. These are the people who said you have to give up all of your life, liberty, and security to stop the flu. I mean, all of this. And this is where and this is why they steal elections. And this is why they call everybody to the right of Karl Marx a fascist. I mean, it's all designed to browbeat you and overlay onto you a false reality, going back to Philip K. Dick, of how this world operates so that they can benefit to drive their agenda as opposed to your agenda. So their goal is to sell you your own chains into slavery. Now, that's cribbing from Marx, but that's not what the capitalist does. That's what the tyrant does. But Marxists are really good at redefining terms and then going forward. So they'll redefine corporatism or fascism as capitalism and then use that as as a false antipode to their proposed solution, which is communism. Right. And it doesn't matter. It's all collectivism. It's all forcing the individual to subsume themselves into the collective at the point of a gun. Now, if you live in a system like that, where this is maximally extractive of all our profit, we wind up as feudal serfs. Like in the Matrix, we wind up as a battery. Literally, they told us in the Matrix what this was going on. Visually, a battery that drives the engine of our own slavery. That metaphor is very powerful. It's also a system that will eventually fail due to its own internal consistency. You can't do that to people for very long. They will eventually say, you know what? No. Because, and this is where application of some very basic economic principles, which are based in human behavior, human psychology, come from. There is something called the law of diminishing marginal utility. It's a very simple law. It's very simple. It just says, look, every time you acquire the next unit of a thing, it's worth less to you than the previous unit. Meaning, you're dying of thirst. That first sip of water is life or death. The second sip of water, not quite life or death. Eventually, you have too much water, you drown. Right? So this is the spectrum of your value preference versus time. That is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Well, you can look at it this way. And I wrote a blog post recently where I put it simply. I said, as the marginal utility of effectively acquiescing with the tyrant pointing a gun at you rises to the point where the benefit of resisting the tyrant, when they reach equilibrium, that's when everything shifts. When I look at the situation and I go, you know what? Okay, I'll submit to this because I'm still benefiting from this system, even if it's marginal. But the day that I don't benefit from it anymore, that's the day that the tyrant has to put maximal amount of pressure on you to stay within their system. And that's when the cost benefit analysis shifts to the opposite. And then everybody starts picking up their guns, their pitchforks, their knives, and starts rolling the guillotines down, the Champs-Élysées. This is what happens. And you can see it, and you can talk about it in terms of marginal utility. You can talk about it in terms of you can in any way you want. But this is what is happening, and this is where we are. So in financial markets, we can say, well, look, today the debt-based monetary system has crossed the Rubicon where we've gone asymptotic functionally on how many dollars of debt we need to generate new dollars of GDP. When we cross the threshold of $1 of debt creating $1 of GDP, that system was broken. We hit that in 2008. We're now at like $14 of debt generate $1 of GDP. And next year it'll be 20, and then 30, and then 40, and it's rising. And this is again why mathematics, why like some of these there are real philosophical lessons within the disciplines of mathematics, physics that have everything to do with human behavior, and they map onto human behavior, and they're great metaphors, at least for me, because this is the way I think. And everybody can map them differently, but this is where we are, and this is what I describe on a daily basis, is taking that view and then just applying it everywhere. And when you start to see people who are used to having power feel threatened that they're going to lose that power, you're a therapist, you know what that looks like. They get violent, they get angry, they lash out like a drowning man, and they'll take anybody down with them. We are living today with a group of old moneyed oligarchs in Europe who are willing to burn the world to the ground in the form of World War III with the Russians and the Chinese, rather than give up their old power. That's where we are. That's what we're all feeling. That's why there's a bull market in therapy.
Yes.
That's why there's a bull market in zombie movies and and end of the world stories,
Yeah.
because we're all feeling it. But, we don't all have the tools to express it, but we have the tools to react to it. Right. And
Mm.
so
So,
it's why
Tom,
the intersection of politics, markets, and culture are so very important. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I agree. So, Tom, you cannot squeeze blood out of a stone.
No.
And we, the people treated like serfs, are the stones starting to revolt?
Yes. Go look at France. Go look at the United States. The election of Donald Trump was a big moment of the Stones saying, you know what, that's enough. The rise of Ron Paul in 2008 and in 2012, where they stole the freaking nomination from him. And now have just basically admitted it, told you what was going on. The selection of Joe Biden, the first fungal president, because he's a mushroom sporifying in the White House. The guy's not freaking there. Like anybody with 3 brain cells to rub together to make a spark knows that Joe Biden's brain's not making any. Like it's not hard, but but we believe what we want to believe if we're still stuck staring at the wall of Socrates' cave and believing that those chains that are on our wrists forcing us to do so are actually real. They're not. All you got to do is look away. But
There's a
part of what they're
curtain.
doing is to constantly create anxiety so that you can't look away. My job is to cut through that and go, by the way, everything on the wall isn't even there. What's really there is this. What you're seeing is this. What's really there is this. And this, again, gets back to Philip K. Dick. Idios cosmos versus koinos cosmos. Inner reality versus true reality, right? Well, stuff that he wrote about all the time. And every one of his books was about that. So it doesn't matter. That's why when I bring up the Matrix, realize that, on Neo's desk at the beginning of the movie is a copy of Philip K. Dick's Ubik, which is what literally the Matrix is like a retelling. Like Ubik is the one Philip K. Dick book they've never directly adapted into a film because they can't. They've already done it 12 times in so many different and so many variations, iterations. Nobody in Hollywood will touch the book now because it'll just look derivative, even though it was the source material.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Tom, you're trying to pull back the curtain for what is actually reality. And what would you tell the people? This is the reality.
I would tell them that they have a hell of a lot more power than they think they do. I would tell them that Jordan Peterson, recent turn to work with Ben Shapiro notwithstanding, is absolutely right with that. Cleaning your room and getting your own house in order is the first step towards improving the universe. You can't expect to help people make sense of the world if you're not willing to try and make sense of yourself and get your own life in order. I'm not saying that my life is in order. My house certainly needs an overhaul. But at the very least, if you're, if that version, if in order for me to do what I do publicly means that my private space needs to be, I need to pay somebody a couple $100 a month to clean my house because I don't have the bandwidth to clean my house. Well, then that's a different story, right? That's a different aspect of this. But I recognize the fact that the house needs to be cleaned at the very least for the first time. And,
Ooh.
Oh yeah. So, it's like everything else. We all, and that's part of what my wife and I have been doing for years now. And COVID gave us a very interesting opportunity. It gave a lot of people a lot of interesting opportunities, which is to sit down and really reassess what is and is not important in your life. Right? Because all of a sudden you're not going to work every day. You're not constantly on the hamster wheel and all of these things that are in front of you that are supposedly so damn important. And then you realize, oh my God, I barely know who my wife is and I barely know who my children are. And why am I doing this? I hate my job. Why am I doing this? And it's literally Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads, right? It's that, it's that song, and it's a great song, and everybody should listen to it, especially the live version on Stop Making Sense. So, but yeah, you're like, all of a sudden, a lot of people did this. Wow, what am I doing? How did I get here? What do I want? Where am I going to go? And
yes,
that's also helping to drive the change. And all they have to do now is continue to take the next step. I'm not saying I'm right about everything. Please no. What I'm saying is you put out into the world ideas that challenge people's perspective and make them think differently about what it is that they do. I mean, if they do that and that affects some kind of substantive change away from this insane reality that they've placed in front of us, which is that you need to eat bugs and live in a pod to save the world from climate change and I mean, these people are talking about assisted suicide as a growth industry now. I'm just waiting for them to to do IPOs and assisted suicide so that Warren Buffett can get in, Warren Buffett can, make billions on it. I'm like, really? Yeah, no, that's disgusting. And it's anti-human, and it's anathema to the human existence. And I think that part of the reason, so when you think about the ideological fight, now I've been focused here on the West, but when you think about the ideological fight between, it's not good and evil, because it's just different sides, it's just different shades of evil. Here in the West, it's the private formation of capital as defined by Davos, and the private formation of capital as defined by the U.S. commercial banking system. I think that's a break point. But then also in the bigger context is those who are post-communist, let's just put it that way, and those who are proto-communist as philosophical level are fighting it out. The Russians and the Chinese are post-communist. Is the Chinese Communist Party still nominally communist? Are they still potentially ideologically aligned with, Maoism? Maybe. Are the Chinese people there? No. Same thing with the Russians. The Russians are Russians are much farther along this route than the Chinese are, which is, Putin's made this abundantly clear. He said so at St. Petersburg. I think it was St. Petersburg last year at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. It was either there or at Valdai, one or the other. He said, look, it might have actually been in the declaration of war speech against Ukraine, where he said, look, communism is a European idea that you people foisted on us and nearly destroyed the Russian culture with. You gave it to us like a virus. All but calling out that Lenin, which is true, was backed by European banks to overthrow the Tsar. This stuff goes all the way back. I mean, in effect, saying, look, it's always been the British Crown. It's always been the Bank of England. Don't kid yourselves. It's always been these people. And when you listen to Putin speak carefully about who he has an axe to grind with, it's always the Anglo-Saxons. It's not necessarily the Americans. When he talks about financial markets, he talks about the Americans. When he talks about everything else, he talks about the Anglo-Saxons. Big distinction. But if you and even if you don't believe that, which my partner doesn't, by the way, that Putin is, a practicing Orthodox Christian, in any substantive, in any substantive way, he is effectively promulgating or promoting that version of reality, at the very least, or using that as a means by which to resist the attempts to unseat him and to destroy Russia as a culture, because this is about destroying the Russians as a culture. But at the same time, as I've said many times, never underestimate the desire of Russian Jews to want to kill Russian Christians. That this is as much a bar fight between Slavs as it is anything else that's going on in Ukraine. Okay. And that it doesn't necessarily need to be that's part of what's going on, but then that's being egged on by, the Anglo-Saxons and the old European money that absolutely want to believe that if they do this, they will weaken it will weaken everybody to the point where then 50 years from now, we'll be able to just swoop in and take all of Russia's stuff. Putin's completely hip to this, completely hip to it. Understands how we break these people is by fighting an industrial war of attrition and killing hundreds of thousands of people. Unfortunately, that's what's has to be done. And he's done that successfully in Ukraine. And now NATO is next. And Ukraine will be the cauldron on which this old oligarch system will be a meat grinder, and it will pour all of their money into it, which is our money because they stole it from us. And if the pressure point for the world is to watch, okay, how do sovereigntist forces within the West respond to that by going, you know what, you can't have any more blood. No, and we're not sending our kids over to Ukraine to fight and die for a bunch of bankers in city of London. We're not doing it, or Frankfurt or Milan or the Vatican, or pick your poison. I don't pick your conspiracy of poison. I don't care. They're all probably true to some extent or another.
Okay, so Tom,
my point being is that normal people are like, no, we're not going to be frog marched into a meat grinder, which is the important part for your benefit.
Yes. So Tom, you analyze geopolitics, and for the normies, who are the biggest players? Because you say we, the people, we're going to wake up. There's a point of no return. And so for everyone, who are the puppeteers?
Well, it's always a changing. It's such a hard question to answer without sounding like an idiot. Like, I mean that sincerely, because the propaganda on this has been very, very effective. I mean, the CIA and the MI6 and these people are very, very good at shaping our perceptions about what words mean, about what we're talking about here. But I just want to remind almost every normie that you've ever, that may be listening. It's like, how many conspiracy theories have become conspiracy facts over the last 3 years? And do you think that trend isn't? Do you think at this point that's not a trend that you should consider? Like, I'm not trying to be flip or I'm not even trying to be like rude. I'm literally saying, at some point, when do you look at this differently? And when does your resistance to this need to be focused within as opposed to without? Because we've all done it. We've all been there. And everybody will go through it. And by the way, like, for example, somebody like Naomi Wolf, I don't know if you saw this last week.
Yes.
Naomi Wolf last week came out in big apology to all the conservatives, right? And I was on Twitter, and my crowd is really, really angry. And I have to manage what we call the black pilled, right? The people who are so angry, they just want to see the whole thing collapse and they don't care. And I'm like, no, we have to manage this. Like, Naomi Wolf just apologized to a whole bunch of people. It doesn't matter that she was, I don't care what she did before. She's here now. Yes. You know what we're supposed to do? We're supposed to welcome her with open hearts and open minds into the community and say, yeah, you're welcome here. Thank you for coming across. What you just did took courage. A lot of courage. And I respect it tremendously. I've been waiting for this type of moment where it's honest and it's not fake, like I've seen with like Chomsky and some of the other old, the old leftists. I'm looking at and you can always tell the real converts, the ones who really have truly looked away from Socrates, the shadow play on Socrates' cave, because those are the ones who get all the vitriol. Those are the ones who. That's how you know a man in politics by who his enemies are. Because the media is completely controlled by these people. Pick whoever you want. Go watch Quantum of Solace again, the James Bond movie. It's like, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about these people. They control the media. It's a confluence of old European and American money. Some of it's American, some of it's British, some of it's Canadian, some of it's Australian, some of it's Hong Kong, some of it's in China, some of it's in Russia, some of it's in Israel and the Vatican. It's everywhere. They're everywhere. Sure. But there are players, but there are more powerful players than others. And it's clear that their power center is the European Union, because the European Union is the regulatory scheme that they want to impose on the rest of the world. Okay. That's the key to understanding this. That's why I say it's Europe is the problem. It's not necessarily just Europe, but it's that what they have in Europe, they want the more perfect technocratic union. The Soviet Union wasn't good enough. And they want to turn the United States into that. And they want to normalize everybody's policy to that of the EU by bringing everybody down, as opposed to the EU finally, letting up on, letting the boot off of our necks of regulation and taxation and the rest of it. They're always out there through all of these international globalist institutions like the OECD, the WTO, the IMF, the BIS. All these groups all say the same thing. Well, the United States needs to raise their corporate tax rate. They need to do that. That's code for we all need to normalize with Europe so that we all suck more, as opposed to being more free. No, we have to become we have to become more indebted to the system, more wedded to the system. We're not allowed to get out. And if you listen to people like Christine Lagarde, the head of the ECB, speak, she makes it abundantly clear. We have to cut off all avenues of escape, because if we leave escape hatches in place like Bitcoin or gold or anything else, financially, people will use them. And we can't have that. Like, and she, when she says that, she wasn't just stating a fact. She was saying as a horrified oligarch, we have to stop this. Otherwise, our plans will fail. Well, is that really somebody you want running your life? Maybe Donald Trump isn't such a bad guy. He just happens to be the cheesy property developer from Queens. And you've been gaslit into thinking that he's some other thing. Maybe. Just maybe. Like, and maybe the reason they hated Trump so much was because he was putting things in place behind the scenes in the financial system of the United States that would eventually challenge their authority, which is what he did. And we can thank Trump for that. We can not thank Trump for so many other terrible things that he did as president. I have mixed feelings about that. And again, how you get through to people on this stuff is to say, look, take a balanced view of everybody. And I'm, again, go back to Naomi Wolf, go back to Glenn Greenwald, everybody who look at what they did to Matt Taibbi in Congress this week. It was shameful how they treated him. Why? Because they'll always treat those who voluntarily left the cult worse than those who were never in the cult in the first place. They'll just call us deplorables, whereas they'll try and destroy them, because they have to destroy them, because they create credibility for those who never joined their system in the first place. Which is, again, Trump crossing over. He used to be one of them. And then he said, you know what? You people are crazy. You people are sick. And I'm not doing this. And maybe he did it for his own personal ego and gratification. Maybe he did it a sense of altruism. You can, whatever, I don't care, what his reasons were. And this is another thing that's so very freaking annoying. Having grown up in a Catholic household, I can tell you that, it wasn't good enough to do the right thing. You had to do the right thing for the right reasons, in the right way, or you were still bad. Like, no, I'm allowed to have a different reason for why I do things, but as long as I do the right thing, aren't my actions more important? Oh, no. Intentions are far more important. Oh, really? Okay. Shut up, narcissistic mom and sister. I don't want to talk to you anymore, which is we didn't hear that story. So, but that's clearly a control mechanism by narcissists and by bullies in order to get you to constantly conform to them. And that's another angle on the whole reading geopolitics. Okay. It's not enough to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing for the right reasons. And if you don't do them for the right reasons, well, then you're still bad. And we need to take you over, and we need to take you out. Like, and that stuff is everywhere, Rachel. It's everywhere. And once you see that, once you can see, even if you can see it in like one aspect of the world, right? And some, I don't know, whatever it is, your personal business or whatever, and you can see it in there. Once you identify that dynamic for what it is, well, now you can start using that as a filter and a lens through which to see the entire world. Now, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, everything is so much easier now. And that's what I get from my patrons more than anything else. I get these beautiful DMs on Patreon from these people, from new patrons, and I'm like, and they tell me their life story, and it's like, it's mind blowing, and you're like, and you have no idea. I see the world so much clearer. Thank you. And I'm like, don't go too far down that rabbit hole. Thank you, but at the same time, I'm going to be wrong as much as I'm going to be right. We're in this together. you know, and invariably I hear these stories and people brain dump on unbelievable stories onto me. And I refuse to, of course, ever tell any of them or name names or anything. I clearly respect their privacy. But then, you're sitting there on, first thing in the morning over your first cup of coffee, and it's what I do. I don't know about you, but this is what I do. I go through my inbox, and I clean it out, and I go through my Patreon messages, and I clean those out. And I'm sitting here over a first cup of coffee, and I'm like, oh my God, like, you people are gonna make me cry, and I'm not gonna be able to get any work done today. Because I'm going to be a friggin' emotional mess having read some of these friggin' stories I get from people, and you're just like, you're overwhelmed with the sense of the responsibility that you've arrogated to yourself, that you've curated now, and now that was a big moment for me when it was like, oh my God, I have a responsibility to these people in a way that I never dreamed was going to be part of this, and okay, challenge
Yes.
accepted.
Yes. You're saying that community, we are in it together. Wake up. So less about who are the puppeteers, which globus lord leads, because there's so many and it's
matter.
Constantly changing. You're saying, hey, that's a piece. Be aware. But we, the people,
Have the
we're
opportunity.
in it together. Community.
Yeah, no, and their system has hollowed out our communities. It's broken the bonds between us. Like, and as artificial and fake as the world we have now is, like you and I talking over a Zoom call. It's very cool. The technology is fantastic, but it's not real, right? Because we're not, in the same. I mean, it's good, it's great. Don't get me wrong. It's better than nothing, but it's still a facsimile of real connection, right? Because real connection happens when you're sitting on your back porch with a friend and a whiskey and a cigar, and you're hashing it out, and you really can see, taste, you can really get it's real. You're sitting around a campfire together, over, after Christmas dinner and doing the thing, right? This is where you're connecting with people. This stuff is great. Don't get me wrong. And it's good. And it's powerful because it actually will help drive people to go find each other in their local communities. This is part of the thing we found out earlier in the year. One last thing, and I think this will give you a really good example of where we are. So just before the Christmas holidays, I run a private server for my private Slack server for my patrons, so they get they can ping in, and then that's where we all sit and chat all day. And I check that as all day long, and that's where they bring the world to me. And someone just said, hey, Floridians, we're all here. Like, how many of us are in Florida? Let's get together over the Christmas break. Like, we're going to have some time while the kids are out of school and blah, blah. Let's get together. Christmas. Tom, would you be up there? I'm like, anything within 2.5 hours, I will drive to. Happily. I don't care. Where I am, north of Gainesville, that means I can, all the way down to Tampa, Jacksonville, Tallahassee, Orlando, even Daytona. Like, within that, that's a big space. 5 gallons of gasoline. Let's do the thing, right? Or half a tank of gas, and let's do the thing, right? And I'm thinking to myself, there may be 6, maybe 7 people. We'll take over the back of a Sonny's. I'll eat too many ribs, and and people will be horrified by my eating habits, and it'll be great. And we'll have a good time. And then we'll go find some outdoor coffee shop, and I'll be able to just smoke a cigar, and we'll hold court for a couple of hours. It'll be fun. Lo and behold, I mention it I do twice weekly private podcasts for my patrons. I call them market reports. And I mentioned, in the opening, I'm like, oh, the housekeeping this morning, we're trying to figure out what weekend to get together, the 14th or the 21st January, for anybody in Florida. Anybody in Florida listening to my voice, you're more than welcome to come. Within 3 days, we're at 45 people. By the time we're done, it's 65 people. I have people coming in from Canada and the West Coast. I had somebody drive in from Oklahoma for a 2-hour dinner at Fogo de Chao on International Drive in Orlando. And then, and then a pub crawl after that, where we went to an Irish bar and we sat and, smoked cigars and drank whiskey all that. And Dexter and I stood there in complete and utter shock. Like all of a sudden, like halfway through this, I'm
I'm
like, dude, I
shocked.
need help. I need help putting this thing together. Like I got 65 people who want to get together now. What do I do? And that's when, and then when we did the event, that's when it became real for him, because he's been working in the background, you know, for most of the last 5 years. He couldn't really feel it. He had no real connection to the community, whereas I'm taking care of it every day, and he's he's doing his thing, and he's helping as he, but like, and then what he saw would just completely change his mind about what it is that we've done. We don't publish a financial newsletter and give out a little bit of, and write some articles. We're building a community of very powerful people, personally powerful people, to get together and figure out how we can network and do the thing. And it's a much different thing than what we thought we had, which means, of course, that now we have to rebuild it so that it's maximally effective for these people to communicate. And that's our next goal. And that's what 2023 is going to be about for us. But it was only by getting that visceral experience of having these people, of having, just seeing that and feeling it and being in the room. And you're literally overwhelmed with the responsibility of it. And they're all just happy to be in the room to shake your hand. And I'm like, dude, you have no idea who's happy to shake whose hand here.
Yes. Yes, it is connection and community, and you change your world, Tom.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow, that's amazing. And Tom, my last question for you is, what makes you feel alive?
The opportunity to learn something new tomorrow. I've always said this. I mean, this goes back to when I think I probably had this insight when I was 12, and I'm not kidding, which is that, when you watch, I mean, I don't know where that came from, but maybe when a person loses their desire to learn something new, that's when they should check out, because that's what tomorrow gives you, the opportunity to learn something you didn't know. I'm going to get a little geeky. All information is fractal, right? When you look at a fractal pattern and you dive into it, you see more and more and more and more, right? There's always a new universe to uncover when looking at a Mandelbrot set. You can't not. It doesn't end. Well, the metaphor there, of course, is that the more you know how little you actually know. So, because, well, I know a little bit about chemistry. Well, okay, so do I know enough? What about this aspect? And what about this? And what about this? And then, you just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And geopolitics is the same thing. I started with a big general thesis, and then I had to learn these players, and then I had to learn the countries that were important, and then I realized that I hadn't mapped all the countries. Then you have to learn the personalities of the leaders, and then you've got to dig into the political parties, and then you got to dig into the cultural history, and then balance that with learning about capital markets. And it's not just a matter of saying, well, just buy gold and forget it all. Well, if you want to do that, that's fine. It's not bad, but you're not going to make a whole lot of money until the system breaks. And then you're going to have to figure out, when to sell into that moment. So I tell people all the time, I never thought 10 years ago that I would be sitting here talking about, US German bond spreads and the death of LIBOR. Like, I never in a million years thought I would be sitting here trying to construct carry trades, because the changeover at the Bank of Japan, the change in leadership at the Bank of Japan is going to change everything. Like, I never in a million years, if you had asked me when I first sat down and took a phone call from, Peter Pham, that's the guy I used to ghostwrite for, that this is where I was going to be in 12 years. No way. No way. But that's where we are. Because the universe puts you, if you're open to it, into the right place in the right time with the right people. As long as you're open to it. I'm not a particularly spiritual guy. I was raised Catholic, and I don't have an organized religion. But I don't know, maybe I am. But I do believe that there's something, that this universe is far more interesting and far more unknowable than we give it credit for. And to listen to fake experts in science like Neil deGrasse Tyson tell everybody that it's all just math and numbers and that there's no wonder in the universe, I got no respect for them. None. At all. That's the source of tyranny. No, the universe is amazing, and we should be humbled by it. Understand that it's hostile to our presence because it's trying to kill us. Because, it's the law. It's the second law of thermodynamics, folks. You can't get away from it. And if that's what you have to submit to, then submit to that. If you can't submit to God, then submit to that. It's the same thing. Like, pick your definition thereof and then submit to it, and then be humble in the face of it, and make your way in the world and do your best, and realize that the mark you leave on this world is left at your funeral. Who shows up matters. And I think I learned that at my dad's funeral. Because I learned it at two different funerals. I learned it at my dad's funeral, and then I learned it at my friend Dexter's dad's funeral. We're both old enough that we should have dead fathers. My dad would be 90 today, or 94 today. My dad would be 91 today. And that guy was never going to last more than 65 years. He got all the 65 years that he was allowed to have, or that he allowed himself to have. But at my dad's funeral, my dad didn't like anybody. My dad didn't have any friends that you knew of. Like, I never saw my dad as a social creature, because he wasn't. Well, at least when I knew him, because I was the youngest of four. He was 40 when I was born. And so I always knew my dad as an old man. Like, my conception of my dad is like my age today, 55, right? Hanging out with his youngest son, fixing cars, listening to jazz. This is what we did together, watching movies, and many other things. And he was also my first boss. But by God, did a whole bunch of people show up at his funeral. And it was, for Dad, it was a big deal. It was a big number of people. Then I saw what it looked like when somebody was really a member of a community. When my friend's father died, and we had to stop traffic on I-95 for the funeral train because it was so big. And no one, this is not a famous man, but he was important to that community. So mind equals blown when you start thinking about those things. So I really came to that conclusion that it's what you leave behind that's important. And men in particular, there's a great article by Dr. Gary North called The Third Layer of the Cake. You can look it up on LouRockwell.com. And he talks about, he starts off with, Forrest Gump says life is like a box of chocolates. Well, a man's life, to Dr. North, and I don't remember if it's his dad who told him this, it's like a 3-layer cake. And the first layer, you live for yourself. Your second layer, your father trying to raise your family. And the third layer, it's about the legacy you leave behind. And when you reach that, that's where a man. Woman's life is different. A woman's arc is different. Not necessarily that much different, but it's different. It's a different story. And I would never presume to really make that distinction here. But knowing from a man's perspective that our job is to leave behind structures for the families that will allow the family to survive into the next generation. Our job is not to survive for our own benefit, because that's what men are supposed to do. That's why men go to fight wars, right? Not women and children. Because I raise goats, Rachel. The goats are not they're not just a cute thing in my name. You only need $1. Your nannies are all you need. You need probably $2 if you don't want to have one-eyed goats, and then after 4 or 5 generations. But you have $2 in order to constantly cross your genetic bloodlines. But your nannies are your value. Your babies are your value. recently we had babies the other day, and I was sitting, one of our goats gave birth about a month ago, just about a month ago now. And and whenever that happens, we take the girl and we sequester her off in a little paddock, right? Hay and shelter and everything for her to have the kids in peace, away from the other goats, who, because if it's not the alpha female, who, she's going to be in trouble, because the alpha female will try and stop the birth, because their goats are incredibly territorial and matriarchal. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah. And not good. Like, not good. So yeah, so you do that, and we sit out there just in case there's any complications, because we've been there many times where we've had to pull kids, or help them. We had many a traumatic bad birth, and as she starts to dilate, and I can see that we're like, all right, so we're like 5 minutes away from the big event, and this is a second time mom, so it's usually not that traumatic. And she didn't look like she was carrying triplets or quads or anything. She looks like she has having twins and should be fine. And my wife just looked at me and she said, all right, ready? Arcade universe. She literally looked up at the universe. She said, arcade universe. All I want is easy birth, 2 girls. That's all I want. That would be the optimal outcome. And what do we get? Easy birth, 2 girls. Which is a much different way of looking at the world than we used to look at it, which is, this is going to be terrible.
Wow.
So there it is.
I love it. Always be learning. Thank you so much, Tom Luongo.
Thank you, Rachel. It was a real pleasure this morning.